Welcome to the Animated Apparel Company YouTube channel. I am your host, Russell Crooms, and in today's video, we are covering the history of Spawn. Now, whether you know him for being the highest selling independent comic book series of all time, or for his feature film in the 90s, his animated series, or even for his recent appearance in the newest Mortal Kombat video game, Spawn has been a popular figure in pop culture for the last 30 years or so. The character of Spawn has crossed just about all media and has become somewhat of an icon in 90s culture, or popular 90s culture. Now, in order to get into the history of Spawn, we first need to look back at the life and career of his creator, Todd McFarlane. Now, Todd McFarlane is a Canadian artist that started his comic book career in the 1980s and quickly reached stardom. In the 90s, he was known as one of the biggest entrepreneurs in the industry. But in his teenage years, McFarlane was just another comic book fan with dreams of making it as an artist at either Marvel or DC Comics. He often practiced his craft for almost 15 hours a day and sent over 300 submissions to comic book publishers across the United States in the early 80s. So you've gotta appreciate the grind, man, just to be honest. Now, McFarlane would get his opportunity at Marvel and DC in the mid-80s, and he made a name for himself with his work on titles such as The Incredible Hulk, with writer Peter David, and with his artwork in the Batman Year 2 miniseries at DC Comics. Now, it was here where you begin to see the first similarities to Spawn, as some of his early work at this time included much larger capes, and the capes began to flow a bit more, which was something that he would later go on to use to its full potential with Spawn in the 1990s. But it was his time with the amazing SpiderMan with writer David McFarlane, the co-creator of the villain Venom, where McFarlane reached stardom and quickly became one of the most popular artists in the industry, giving Spider-Man a more modern and dynamic look for that time, which to this day McFarlane still ranks as one of the greatest artists to ever pencil the famous webhead. Now, in 1990, McFarlane was an established star in the industry and worked with both Marvel and DC, but he wasn't truly satisfied, partially due to not having a lot of creative input, and he also wanted a break because he and his wife were expecting their first child. So Marvel offered him his own Spider-Man title, simply called SpiderMan, where he could draw and write with total creative freedom. And while people still debate the writing direction on those issues, no one can deny that it was a commercial and artistic success, with the first issue being one of the highest selling comic books of all time and a crowning achievement for McFarlane. But one of the biggest issues that McFarlane and other young popular artists were unhappy with at that time was that they created so many popular characters for Marvel and they were unable to obtain a fair share for the creative work. So by the end of 1991, they decided to leave Marvel and form their own company, which they called Image Comics. At Image Comics, creators can publish their own comics and keep the rights and retain the vast majority of the profits. They began publishing their own comics in 1992. Now, when it came to McFarlane, his first character under Image Comics was our protagonist of today, Spawn, who he actually had created back in high school. So even back then, McFarlane was already showing the signs of the artistic style he would later become famous for. The first issue of Spawn was published in May of 1992, and it is, to this day, the highest selling independent comic book issue of all time, selling 1.7 million copies, with McFarlane getting the vast majority of the profits compared to the 4%. And no, I'm not jealous of that at all. Well, maybe just a little. Which brings us to Spawn. Spawn is a former Marine colonel, actually Colonel Al Simmons, who died in service working for the CIA, and he gave his soul to the ruler of hell, Malebolgia, in order to see his wife, Wanda, once again. But he didn't read the fine print of his contract and ended up becoming a Hell Spawn, a member of Malebolgia's army, with no recollection of who he was. Al eventually gets his memories back and realizes that 7 years have passed since his death, and Wanda is now married to his former best friend Terry Fitzgerald, and they have a daughter together named Cyan. As Al discovers this and decides to walk away, he decides to live his new life alone, but a war between heaven and hell is raging on, and he finds himself in the middle of it, deciding to protect the ones he cares about while not living under the command of anyone. Spawn was a monumental success in the comic book industry in the 90s and cemented McFarlane's position as one of the most important individuals in comics, also launching the comic book career of artist Greg Capullo, whose work on the title has now become the stuff of legends and just as revered as McFarlane's on the title. Spawn's success and popularity didn't stop with the comics. McFarlane was fully determined to turn this character into a worldwide franchise, and he started his own toy company, producing some of the best toys that the industry has ever seen, positioning him as a force to be reckoned with. This was the time period where McFarlane was coming into his own as a businessman, and this was proven with the release of the 1997 live adaptation film of Spawn, starring Michael Jai White as Al Simmons and grossing over $80 million compared to its $45 million budget. And while the quality of the film is certainly questionable and far from a masterpiece, no one can deny the success of making a blockbuster feature film with an independent character. What was a commercial and artistic success was the HBO Spawn animated series, in which McFarlane had tremendous creative input, and the storyline was much more similar to the comics, especially in the dark and sinister vibe that the character of Spawn obviously thrives in. It lasted 3 seasons, and it gathered many accolades and awards. Keith David's voice acting in the Spawn role was celebrated and well regarded as some of the best work in the industry. Now, the story of Spawn has spawned for over more than 300 comic book issues, making it the longest running independent comic book series of all time. And while McFarlane has been drifting on and off of art duties, he has always kept an eye on the story as Spawn continues to show up in other media such as toys, t-shirts, and of course video games like Mortal Kombat. A new live film adaptation with McFarlane as director and writer is currently in the works, with Jamie Foxx as Spawn and Jeremy Renner as part of the cast. A reboot of the animated series is also in the works, and there are rumors that Keith David might reprise his role as the voice of Spawn. Fingers crossed. Nowadays, McFarlane and Spawn have nothing to prove. The character is a testament to the value of creator-owned properties and the importance of constantly pursuing for greater heights as an entrepreneur. McFarlane is the living embodiment of business and creative independence, with Spawn obviously being the greatest success of his entire career. Now it's time to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Spawn and Todd McFarlane? Is there something we missed in the history of Spawn? Drop us a comment, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that like button. Thank you so much for watching. Alrighty guys, I'm out.